As we learned in the previous module, each of the 6 approaches to biopsychological research has weaknesses. Therefore, biopsychological issues are rarely resolved by a single experiment or study, or by any single approach. Typically, progress is most likely when different approaches are focused on a single problem in a way that the strengths of one approach would compensate for the weaknesses of the others. This is what's known as converging operations. To demonstrate converging operations, we will be looking at Korsakoff syndrome, which is a chronic memory disorder caused by a severe deficiency of thiamine or vitamin B1. This information, however, was not always available. Initially, Korsakoff syndrome was believed to be a direct consequence of the effects of alcohol on the brain. It wasn't until different disciplines of biopsychology converged their operations and made use of their strengths and weaknesses to understand Korsakoff syndrome better. In this example, we will be looking at neuropsychology, which is one of the divisions of biopsychology that studies the psychological effects of brain damage in human patients. As you may remember, neuropsychology cannot be studied in humans by experimentation, meaning that we make use of case studies and or quasi-experimental studies. Using the non-experimental design allowed us to capitalize on one of the strengths of neuropsychology, which is dealing directly with human patients. This allowed us to interview them and ask them about their habits, which, according to the first support for thiamine deficiency studies that came about from neuropsychology, it was based on the discovery that the syndrome is typically found with malnourished individuals who consume little or no alcohol. This challenged our thoughts about Korsakoff syndrome. As stated earlier, this was believed to be a direct result of the effects of alcohol on the brain. Unfortunately, because we cannot do an experiment, we were not able to find cause and effect relationships. To make up for this weakness, we made use of another division of biopsychology, in this case, physiological psychology, which you may remember is a division that studies the neural mechanisms of behavior by directly manipulating the brain in controlled experiments. Experiments with rats provided additional support in which thiamine-deficient rats were compared to otherwise identical groups of control rats, meaning they didn't have any thiamine deficiency. Results showed that those rats who were thiamine deficient displayed memory deficits and patterns of brain damage that were similar to those observed in human alcoholics. While the relevance of research on laboratory animals to human neuropsychological deficits is always open to question, by converging these two disciplines, it allowed us to understand that it is alcoholics who often develop Korsakoff syndrome, but it is not alcohol directly which causes Korsakoff syndrome. Instead, we believe that this syndrome is developed because most of the calorie intake comes from the form of alcohol, which lacks vitamins, and because alcohol interferes with the metabolism of what little thiamine exists, this causes a disease which brings about inflammation of the nerves and heart failure because of the lack of consumption of vitamin B. As you can see, by exploring the possible causes of Korsakoff's using multiple approaches, or as we call them, convergent operations, the findings become more accurate. In conducting scientific studies, empirical evidence is a central part of the scientific method. Empirical evidence is information that's acquired by observation or experimentation. While it may be easy to record how many laps a rat runs or how many calories a rat consumes, or a heartbeat of a rat after being exposed to thiamine, it is difficult to analyze that which cannot be observed. This has been one of the challenges that biopsychologists have faced, as the growing criticism of the scientific community often claims that it is impossible to do empirical studies on things that cannot be observed, such as brainwave patterns. However, scientists use and have used empirical methods to study gravity, evaporation, electricity, and nuclear fission, none of which can be directly observed. However, their effects can be observed, but the processes themselves cannot. In this part of the module, we will look at one of the main goals, which is to characterize through empirical methods the unobservable processes by which the nervous system controls behavior. One of the main challenges of biopsychological research is that neural mechanisms of behavior cannot be directly observed. For example, we cannot see a neuron firing or neurochemicals being secreted from neurons. But in order for this to remain a science, we must make use of empirical research. To do so, scientists measure what they can observe and then use these measures as a basis for inferring what they cannot observe. Looking back to the divisions of Module 1.5, we can look at physiological psychology, which examines the physiological mechanisms that lead to psychological activity. For example, how is your state of mind after a pleasant, good workout? Looking at the relationship between your physiological mechanisms in your body and how you feel can allow us to observe that which is not directly observed. In other words, looking at how certain behaviors impact your psychological activity is one of the ways that we can get around this challenge of biopsychological research. Research does show that individuals who exercise on a regular basis are less likely to be anxious and stressed. Therefore, again using physiological psychology, we can examine and observe that which is not directly observed. Another division of biopsychology is psychophysiology, which examines the ways psychological activities lead to physiological responses. For example, an individual who is nervous because he is going to give a public speech may have some physiological responses. His muscles may be tense, there may be unusual eye movement, or many other indicators of the autonomic nervous system activity. Once again, this would allow us to measure what is not observable in an indirect way.